What happens when the biggest entertainment empire in the world decides you no longer exist? What happens when a studio with more money, more reach, more lawyers, more global influence, and more raw strategic dominance than any single celebrity on earth looks at you and says three deadly words: "You are nothing"? That's the question hanging over Meghan Markle's career today. A question Hollywood insiders are whispering about behind closed doors, in studio hallways, in conference rooms with frosted glass, the kind of places where reputations are built and destroyed. Because if you think Amazon MGM Studios is just annoyed or frustrated or mildly inconvenienced by Meghan Markle, think again. The whispers coming out of Amazon's Los Angeles office suggest something far more aggressive, far more personal, and far more final. We're talking about a blackout, a burial, a quiet but deliberate erasure of her presence from future projects, negotiations, and conversations. And it all started with one moment Meghan and her team believed would scare Amazon into bending. But instead, it enraged them. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Let's start with the question that everyone is asking. How did Meghan Markle go from being one of the most courted names in Hollywood to becoming the woman Amazon MGM allegedly vowed to never work with again? Think about it. This is the same woman who once had global sympathy, a Netflix mega deal, multiple public platforms, magazine covers, a podcast contract, and the halo effect of royal controversy swirling around her. She was valuable. She was a conversation. She was marketable in a chaotic, unpredictable, tabloid-friendly way. But the Meghan brand has changed. The market has changed. Hollywood's patience has changed. And Amazon's threshold for risk? Well, they're saying it snapped. But why now? Why this suddenly sharp shift? Why this dramatic, borderline hostile tone from a company that typically avoids emotional narratives and instead moves with cold, calculated strategy? That's where the story heats up. Because according to multiple insiders who claim to have seen communications, Amazon MGM executives were already losing confidence in Meghan long before the public ever caught a hint of trouble. They were monitoring patterns, missed deadlines, shifting narratives, inflated demands, unexpected tantrums, PR contradictions, and the kind of unpredictability that makes studios nervous. Nervous people make expensive mistakes. And expensive mistakes are the one thing Hollywood corporations refuse to tolerate. But the real explosion? The real detonation point? It came the moment Meghan allegedly threatened to sue. And not just any lawsuit. A lawsuit that Amazon interpreted as an attempt at leverage, a threat meant to corner them, pressure them, embarrass them, or force their hand. And that's where everything changed. Because if there is one thing a corporation hates more than bad PR, it's being threatened by someone they believe is already on thin ice. Meghan may have thought she was protecting herself, but Amazon thought she was attacking them. Picture the scene for a moment. Imagine a boardroom filled with executives, legal advisors, marketing strategists, PR specialists, and internal risk analysts, all staring at the same three-sentence message from Meghan's representatives. Imagine the silence. Imagine the eye contact. Imagine the realization that this wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a declaration of war. And once Meghan fired the first shot, Amazon MGM responded the only way they know how: decisively, aggressively, and with a level of force no individual celebrity can withstand. But here's the twist that raises the stakes. Amazon didn't just reject her threat. They didn't just push back. They allegedly vowed to bury the entire idea of Meghan Markle as a viable Hollywood asset. Not metaphorically, strategically. They prepared to shut doors, to reroute opportunities, to lock away projects, to erase her name from development lists, to stop including her in upcoming conversations, to make her vanish from the Hollywood rotation without ever having to say a single public word. And yes, you heard that right, erase. Because the word circulating internally isn't pause. It isn't delay. It isn't reevaluate. It's erase. A deliberate choice. A deliberate strategy. A quiet blackout of her brand. But now let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to realize a corporation is more powerful than your entire public image? What it feels like to discover the people you once believed needed you don't? Have you ever imagined what it must be like to watch Hollywood slam doors you thought were already open? To hear from insiders that your names spark fear, fatigue, or frustration instead of interest or opportunity. To go from being fought over to being quietly avoided, this is where Meghan Markle finds herself now. And it's not just professional. It's deeply personal. Because everything about Meghan's public identity is rooted in the belief that she can shape narratives, that she can speak her truth, frame her story, and control the lens through which the world sees her. But Amazon MGM is bigger than any narrative. It's bigger than PR. It's bigger than celebrity influence. And when they feel threatened, they don't negotiate. They retaliate. Now here's where things take a darker turn, and where the stakes become more thrilling, more intense, and more explosive than anything Meghan has faced since leaving the royal family. Because Amazon MGM didn't just feel threatened by her legal tone. They felt provoked. And provocation leads to investigation. Investigation leads to documentation. Documentation leads to evaluation. And evaluation leads to decisions. Decisions that change careers, reputations, and futures. And if the whispers are true, Amazon's evaluation of Meghan Markle was brutal. Let me paint this picture clearly. Inside Amazon towers, executives reportedly used phrases like liability, unpredictable, uninsurable, PR conflict, brand volatility, and long-term risk. These are the words you never want to see next to your name if you want a future in the entertainment industry. These are the words that end negotiations before they start. These are the words that make agents nervous and publicists sweat. These are the words that quietly close every door you didn't even know you needed opened. But here's the emotional twist. Meghan didn't see this coming. She believed she had leverage. She believed she had the narrative advantage. She believed Amazon MGM would back down because, historically, studios fear public perception. But Amazon didn't fear her. If anything, they were prepared for her. They were ready. They had receipts. They had notes. They had a file Meghan and her team allegedly didn't know existed. And that file is where this story gets chilling. Imagine discovering that a corporation has compiled every inconsistency, every contradiction, every public meltdown, every behind-the-scenes conflict, every negotiation mishap, every press incident, every moment where expectations weren't met, all organized, documented, time-stamped, and ready to be used if she ever attempted to escalate legally. Imagine realizing Amazon had been watching quietly, taking notes, calculating outcomes, preparing for the day they might need to defend themselves. Because according to insiders, the moment Meghan threatened to sue, Amazon opened the file. Think about how that must have felt. The shock, the fear, the humiliation, the realization that the story she believed she was controlling was never hers to control at all. And here's the contradiction that makes this story so fascinating. Meghan has built her public brand around empowerment, around reclaiming her voice, around speaking out. But the more she speaks, the more Hollywood listens. And not always in the way she hopes. Because when you become known for conflict, for drama, for unpredictability, studios don't want to support you. They want to protect themselves from you. That's the irony. That's the tension. That's the emotional sting of this entire saga. So why does this matter now? Why is this story exploding at this exact moment? Because Amazon MGM allegedly made their decision recently, very recently. And not only did they make a decision, they made a vow. Avoid Meghan Markle indefinitely. No new deals. No new conversations. No new opportunities. No reconsiderations. A hard wall. A corporate freeze. A quiet career burial. But what makes it even more dramatic is this. Meghan still believes she can fight this. She still believes she can win. She still believes she can take on a corporation with more influence than any royal scandal, any media storm, any PR campaign. And that belief, that determination, that refusal to back down, it's admirable. It's bold. It's also the very thing fueling this entire fire. Because the moment Meghan pushes back, Amazon pushes harder. And now we are at the turning point. The moment everything shifts. The moment the story stops being about negotiations and starts being about survival, professional survival, reputational survival, and personal survival in the cutthroat world of Hollywood, where power is silent, consequences are swift, and once your name becomes too complicated, you're done. But here's the part that truly changes everything. The part Amazon reportedly discovered, the detail they believe Meghan never wanted to come out. The revelation that escalated this feud from conflict to total war. And that secret? Well, what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. But before we get to that bombshell, let me pull you straight into the moment everything snapped. Because here's the question we need to ask right now. What exactly pushed Amazon MGM Studios from quiet frustration into full-scale rejection? What moment turned murmured annoyance into a vow to bury Meghan Markle's Hollywood footprint entirely? What crack in the wall finally burst and flooded the entire studio with that one deadly conclusion? We are done? That moment didn't happen in a courtroom, or in a magazine interview, or even in one of Meghan's carefully curated public statements. It happened inside a boardroom, a glass room, bright with daylight, cold with tension, and thick with the uncomfortable realization that this wasn't a partnership anymore. This was a problem, a liability, a storm no one wanted to weather. And that storm walked in carrying her name. Imagine this scene for a second. Executives settling into their chairs, laptops open, coffee steaming, everyone preparing for another day in the unpredictable swirl of high-level entertainment strategy. They expected discussions about budgets, scripts, release schedules, market forecasts. What they didn't expect was a crisis meeting. A meeting where Meghan Markle's name kept getting repeated in a tone that didn't sound frustrated. It sounded exhausted. Not angry, not outraged. Exhausted. Because fatigue is far more dangerous than anger. Fatigue leads to final decisions. Fatigue leads to cutting ties. Fatigue leads to shutting doors that never reopen. And that fatigue had been building for months. People imagine Hollywood collapses happen in explosive moments, shouting, slamming doors, meltdowns. But in reality, they happen quietly. They happen in patterns. They happen in the subtle shift of how people talk about you. They happen in the way people sigh when your name comes up. They happen in the way executives start saying things like, "We need to be realistic," or "This is becoming more trouble than it's worth," or "We can't keep doing this." And that's exactly what was happening inside Amazon MGM long before the public heard anything. But what pushed it over the edge wasn't just the fatigue. It was a single moment, a single action, that made the studio say enough. And that moment? It arrived not with Meghan herself, but with the digital ping of an incoming message. A message that didn't just raise eyebrows, it raised alarms. Before we get there, let's rewind slightly. Because to understand the explosion, we need to understand the pressure building inside the studio beforehand. Amazon MGM is not a traditional Hollywood studio. It's a tech-backed juggernaut with a corporate spine built on analytics, risk mitigation, and strategic forecasting. They don't make decisions based on emotion. They make decisions based on patterns, data, and potential liabilities. For months, executives had been tracking Meghan's trajectory like weather forecasters watching a tropical storm shift into unpredictable territory. Her public statements, her shifting alliances, her PR misfires, her tendency to contradict herself in media appearances, all of it was being monitored, logged, and evaluated by teams trained to predict trouble before it arrives. And here's where the contradiction hits hard. Meghan believed her relevance protected her. Amazon believed her unpredictability endangered them. Whose perspective has more power? In Hollywood? Always the studios. Now picture that boardroom. Tension swirling. Fatigue settling. And then, the email. 3 sentences. Short, sharp, pointed, and loaded with threat. The kind of message that doesn't open a conversation but fires a warning shot. The kind of message that makes attorneys straighten in their chairs and executives mutter under their breath. The kind of message that doesn't just ask for something. It demands compliance. That was Meghan's mistake. The moment she threatened legal action, Amazon felt something shift inside their corporate DNA. They stopped seeing her as a partner and started seeing her as a threat. And here's a question for you. Have you ever pushed someone too far without realizing it? Have you ever crossed a line thinking you were defending yourself, only to discover you just set off an alarm you can't silence? That's exactly what Meghan did. Her team thought they were asserting power. Amazon thought they were being attacked. And in the corporate world, every attack must be neutralized. The message made its way up the ladder. From assistant to manager. From manager to vice president. From vice president to legal counsel. And finally, to the top. The executives who decide what gets made, what gets canceled, who gets supported, and who gets quietly erased. As more eyes landed on the message, the more unified the reaction became. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was an escalation. And Amazon MGM doesn't back down from escalations. Now let's get back in that boardroom. The meeting that followed the email wasn't routine. It wasn't casual. It wasn't even framed as a discussion. It was categorized internally as urgent. The tone was clipped. Eyes were sharp. Attitudes were tired. And the question on the table wasn't, how do we fix this? Or how do we negotiate with her? The real question, the question nobody wanted to say out loud, but everyone was thinking, was, is this worth it anymore? One executive reportedly broke the silence with a line that's still echoing through industry rumor mills. At this point, we're being held hostage by one person's brand chaos. Harsh. Yes. But accurate? From their perspective, absolutely. And here's where the emotional twist sneaks in. Meghan didn't see herself as chaotic. She saw herself as misunderstood, misrepresented, attacked, fighting for fairness. The contradiction is painful, isn't it? Two sides convinced they're the victim. Two narratives colliding. Two truths that cannot coexist. So the meeting continued. Voices raised slightly. Notes scribbled. Risks listed. Cost calculated. And then came the moment. The moment that shifted from discussion to decision. A senior executive leaned forward and said the sentence that froze the room. She's nothing to us. Harsh, shocking, brutal, and, according to insiders, exactly how they felt. Not as a human being, not as a person, but as an asset, as a business investment, as a professional partner. In their eyes, Meghan no longer held value. And in Hollywood, when your value drops, your opportunities disappear. Ask yourself, how does someone recover from being labeled nothing by a corporation with global power? How do you rebuild influence when the machine that controls exposure decides you no longer matter? And more importantly, how does someone fight back? Because Meghan didn't fold. She fired back. She doubled down. She refused to let them wipe her off their slate without a fight. And that resistance, that refusal to disappear quietly, is what escalated this into a war. But the war didn't officially begin in that boardroom. It began later, hours later, after the executives adjourned, after the decision was quietly agreed upon, after the legal team drafted a preliminary internal report outlining the next steps. The war began when Meghan's team received the response, a response that was cold, firm, and final, a response that ignored her threat entirely, a response that signaled Amazon wasn't afraid. And that's when Meghan made her next move. A move the studio didn't expect. A move her own advisors warned her against. A move that lit the fuse on everything that followed. Because Meghan wasn't ready to be erased. She wasn't ready to accept nothing. She wasn't ready to let the studio treat her as disposable. And what she did next shocked even the most seasoned Hollywood insiders. But the real shock? The real twist? The real detonation? It wasn't Meghan's move that terrified Amazon. It was hers. But amplified by something the studio had already uncovered. Something they believed Meghan never wanted anyone to see. Something that transformed the conflict from a negotiation into a total, unstoppable, career-altering firestorm. And that revelation? Well, that's where this story starts to turn volcanic. So what was this volcanic revelation simmering beneath the surface? What was the detail Amazon MGM discovered? The detail they believed Meghan never wanted exposed. The detail that took this feud from heated disagreement to full-scale corporate warfare. Before we get there, let's step into the moment that ignited everything, the email. Because if Chapter 1 revealed the breaking point, Chapter 2 reveals the spark. The tiny, digital spark that set the entire Hollywood landscape on fire for Meghan Markle. And here's the unsettling truth. Meghan didn't understand how much power Amazon held. She didn't understand how fragile the relationship already was. She didn't understand that pushing a corporation that's already irritated is like poking a sleeping lion. You might think it's harmless until the lion opens its eyes. Here's the question that drives this entire chapter. What exactly did Meghan say in that email? What words were so sharp, so loaded, so provocative that seasoned executives, people who handle conflict for a living, unanimously agreed? This is the final straw? And let's be honest for a moment. We've seen Meghan's communication style play out publicly. Direct, emotional, dramatic, defensive, sometimes contradictory. and always framed as protecting herself from perceived attacks. But in Hollywood, the tone that works in interviews does not work in boardrooms. Studios don't care about emotion. They care about liability. They care about control. They care about consistency. So when Meghan's email arrived, wrapped in threat, pulsing with indignation, and written in a tone that felt less like negotiation and more like a warning, Amazon didn't flinch. They reacted. But before we break down that message, we need to explore the context Meghan didn't recognize. Because that's where the emotional punch of this story lands. Not in the email itself, but in the fact that Meghan misread the temperature of the room completely. She thought she was pushing back. Amazon thought she was trying to strong-arm them. And in business, perception is everything. Behind the scenes, Meghan had been growing increasingly frustrated. Meetings had slowed. Communications had become colder. Decisions she expected quick answers to were suddenly being reviewed or reconsidered. And you can imagine how that must have felt for her, someone used to attention, momentum, and immediate responses. Someone used to being the story. Someone used to being pursued, not delayed. So instead of acknowledging the shift, Meghan interpreted the hesitation as disrespect. And disrespect is something she has always reacted to quickly and aggressively. So she decided to confront it. She typed an email, and the email changed everything. Industry whispers say the message contained 3 key elements, and all 3 hit like a punch to the gut. First, an accusation that Amazon was breaching commitments. Second, an insinuation that the studio was acting in bad faith. Third, a line, short, sharp, unmistakably threatening, implying she was prepared to take legal action if they did not respond in the way she wanted. And here's the emotional irony. Meghan likely believed she was being strong, empowered, assertive, setting boundaries. But to Amazon, it was a red flag, a line crossed, a signal that she was no longer just a partner. She was a potential attacker, a risk, a headache waiting to explode in public. And let me ask you something directly. Do you think a massive corporation feels fear when a celebrity threatens legal action? Do you think executives with billion-dollar budgets tremble when a single individual implies they'll go to war? Of course not. Meghan thought she was delivering a warning that would force Amazon to reconsider. Instead, she delivered a warning that forced Amazon to shut down the relationship entirely. But here's where this gets even more dramatic. The email wasn't just badly timed. Amazon MGM had already prepared documentation on her. They had compiled inconsistencies. They had flagged patterns. They had analyzed the risks of continuing the partnership. In essence, the storm was already forming. Meghan's email wasn't the beginning. It was the lightning strike. Let's go deeper into the emotional core of this. Imagine Meghan sitting at her laptop, feeling unheard, feeling dismissed, feeling sidelined. Emotions she has openly spoken about before. Imagine her thinking, if I don't push back, they'll walk all over me. Imagine her convincing herself that her tone was justified, maybe even necessary. Because when you feel wronged, force feels like your only defense. But imagine the shock she must have felt when the email backfired instantly. The cold silence, the sudden shift in tone, the distant, formal replies, the subtle but unmistakable repositioning of her from partner to problem. Amazon's response wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't angry. It was calm. And calm is worse. Calm means they already made up their mind. Calm means they're preparing the exit strategy. Calm means they no longer see value in fighting for the relationship. Meghan misinterpreted the calm. She believed it meant she scared them. Amazon interpreted their own calm as confirmation. We made the right call. But here's the twist, the one that takes this story from conflict into catastrophe. While Meghan was reacting emotionally, Amazon was analyzing strategically. And strategy always wins. Now let's look at what happened inside the studio after the email was circulated. A roundtable of legal advisors dissected it line by line. Risk analysts evaluated the implications. Communication specialists drafted internal talking points. Executives debated the threshold of tolerable conflict. And every group arrived at the same conclusion. This is no longer viable. Think about that word, viable. It's cold. It's clinical. It's surgical. And when a corporation decides you're not viable, it doesn't mean you're disliked. It means you're done. And here's the punch in the chest. Meghan didn't understand that she had just stepped into a battlefield she could never win. She wasn't fighting a person. She was fighting a system, a machine, a corporation with unlimited legal resources, unlimited PR reach, and unlimited stamina. But then something happened that made everything even worse. Someone forwarded Meghan the internal memo. A memo summarizing the studio's concerns. A memo that used terms like instability, unreliable partner, difficulty sustaining consistent narratives, and potential for escalating conflict. A memo she was never supposed to see. A memo that didn't just outline business concerns, it outlined personal criticisms. Harsh criticisms. When Meghan read it, she reportedly panicked. Then she spiraled. Then she exploded. Because who wouldn't? Imagine reading a file about yourself describing you as erratic, unpredictable, and dangerous to work with. Imagine learning that a corporation sees you not as someone with influence, but someone with consequences. And Meghan reacted exactly how anyone in her position would, emotionally, impulsively, fiercely. She sent another message, a longer one, sharper, angrier. And this is where insiders say she made the fatal mistake. She accused them of deliberately undermining her career. She accused them of discrimination. She accused them of sabotage. She accused them of retaliation. And worst of all, she accused them publicly. Because emails aren't the only thing Meghan can send. She also leaked. Not directly. She's too experienced for that. But through channels, whispers, sources close to the Sussexes, voices that sound unofficial but always trace back to her camp. The kind of leaks that say things like Meghan feels mistreated or Meghan believes Amazon is targeting her unfairly. And that's what Amazon interpreted as the real escalation. Why? Because now it wasn't private. It was public. And public conflict with a studio never ends well for the celebrity, but it always ends fast. So Amazon responded the only way a corporation can, with an internal lockdown. Communications were consolidated. Projects involving her were paused. Meetings were canceled. References to her name were scrubbed from scheduling notes. And the internal message was simple: we do not engage. But Meghan wasn't done. She was hurt, offended, outraged. And in her mind, she was right. She had been wronged. She had been dismissed. She had been blacklisted unfairly. So she decided to do the last thing any studio wants a volatile partner to do. She pushed harder. But remember that volcanic revelation we teased earlier? The thing Amazon uncovered? The detail they believed Meghan wanted to keep hidden? That was the real detonator. That was the real reason they vowed to bury her. That was the real catalyst behind this career-ending fallout. And that revelation? Well, the moment it surfaced inside Amazon's headquarters, everything shifted from defensive strategy to full-scale eradication. So what surfaced? What piece of information was so alarming, so destabilizing, so reputation-shattering that it made Amazon MGM Studios jump from merely distancing themselves from Meghan to wanting her erased entirely? Here's the shocking part. It wasn't scandalous in a tabloid sense. It wasn't salacious gossip. It wasn't something explosive about her marriage, her family, or her past. It was something more dangerous, something Hollywood fears more than anything else: a pattern. A pattern that pointed to one terrifying conclusion for any studio: uninsurability. And if you know anything about the entertainment industry, you know that word is the closest thing to a death sentence an actor, producer, or public figure can receive. But before we break open that terrifying revelation, let me pull you into the emotional core of this chapter. Because this is where the story twists. Where the narrative stops being about a single email or a studio conflict and becomes something bigger, deeper, more chilling. This is where Hollywood's unspoken rules come into play. The rules no one talks about publicly. The rules that determine who gets protected and who gets pushed out, who gets opportunities and who gets quietly erased. These rules don't get written in contracts. They get written in whisper networks, reputation ecosystems, quiet evaluations, risk assessments that never see the light of day. And Meghan, without realizing it, had walked straight into code red territory. So let me ask you directly. Have you ever been in a situation where everyone around you sees a red flag, but you don't? Where everyone else knows something is spiraling, but you still believe everything can be fixed with one powerful move? That's exactly where Meghan was. She thought she was pushing back. She thought she was standing up for herself. She thought she was asserting her power. Meanwhile, Amazon was quietly categorizing her as a risk they could no longer justify. And once a studio labels you a risk, the countdown begins. Now, let's get back to that revelation, the thing that changed everything. Insiders claim that Amazon's legal and compliance departments had compiled a behavioral pattern file on Meghan. Not scandalous, not tabloid-driven, professional, cold, data-based. It documented inconsistencies across communications, conflicts in project expectations, shifts in demands, breakdowns in negotiations, timeline disruptions, the kinds of patterns that suggest unpredictability, and unpredictability is poison for a corporation with billion-dollar stakes. But that wasn't the code red moment. The code red moment came when Amazon cross-referenced Meghan's pattern with industry insurance requirements. And what they found? Her behavior was flirting with the threshold of a label no actor or producer ever wants tied to their name. Difficult to insure. Now let's pause here, because that phrase might sound like Hollywood jargon, but in reality, it's the equivalent of a professional obituary. Insurance is the backbone of entertainment. Without insurance, you cannot film, you cannot distribute, you cannot finance. No studio can legally put tens or hundreds of millions of dollars behind someone the insurance companies see as unstable, unpredictable, or high risk. And while Meghan is not an actress on a production set, Amazon MGM's partnership with her required insurability for projects she touched, for deals she was attached to, for initiatives that relied on her presence and participation. Her rising unpredictability, the lawsuits, the public contradictions, the PR blow-ups, the pattern of conflict. All of it pushed her closer to a line no studio wants to flirt with. And when Amazon realized this, they panicked. Not publicly, not loudly, quietly, strategically, with the kind of cold fear corporations feel only when they realize something that once seemed manageable isn't. But why did this shift them from distancing her to erasing her? Because here's the part most people don't know. When a studio identifies someone as potentially uninsurable, it doesn't just affect one project. It contaminates everything around them. Their name becomes a corporate toxin, a trigger for risk departments, a red flag for legal teams, a problem that affects budgeting, forecasting, distribution, international licensing, corporate partnerships, investor relationships, and even internal morale. One person's instability becomes everybody's problem, and Amazon wasn't going to let that happen. But the story takes an even darker emotional turn here. Because Meghan, completely unaware of this insurance storm happening behind the scenes, continued escalating publicly. She leaked. She vented. She made calls. She confronted people. She reacted as someone who believed she was fighting for fairness, dignity, respect. Meanwhile, Amazon saw every move she made as another red flag, another data point, another sign that the risk factor wasn't theoretical, it was active. Let me pull you deeper into this psychological contradiction. Meghan sees herself as someone battling the odds, misunderstood, mistreated, misrepresented. She sees the world reacting unfairly to her. She sees herself as the protagonist in a story filled with antagonists trying to silence her. But Amazon, they don't see protagonists or antagonists. They see liabilities and assets. And in their eyes, Meghan's liability score was rising fast. Here's something important. Celebrities think they get canceled by the public. But that's only half the story. The real cancellation happens quietly in rooms with no cameras, when executives decide you're not worth the mess. When they mark you not as controversial, but as costly. And Amazon's internal risk modeling reportedly placed Meghan in a category no one expected to see her in so soon. Escalatory personality with unpredictable public reactions. Harsh. Maybe. Accurate from their viewpoint? Absolutely. Now picture the atmosphere inside Amazon's headquarters as this assessment circulated. Lawyers scribbling notes. Risk analysts highlighting phrases. PR teams calculating potential damage. Executives whispering over the table. No shouting. No dramatic gestures. Just quiet agreement. The kind that feels heavy because it's final. Someone reportedly said, "We have no choice. We need to distance the brand entirely." Another added, "This can't touch any of our upcoming projects." And someone else closed the discussion with the line that sealed Meghan's Hollywood fate. Let's cut her loose and bury the association. And let me ask you again, How do you fight a corporation that has already decided they don't need you? How do you win when the other side holds all the cards, all the data, and all the power? But here's the twist that makes this chapter truly gripping. Meghan didn't know any of this. She had no idea Amazon was discussing her insurability. She had no idea they were classifying her as a risk. She had no idea they viewed her email as a weapon fired at the wrong target. She had no idea they were preparing to erase her not because they hated her, but because she scared them. And then came the moment that officially triggered Hollywood's quiet code red. An industry insider, someone from a completely different studio, reached out to Amazon. And what did they say? Not something dramatic. Not something insulting. Not something emotional. They asked a simple question. Off the record. Is she worth the trouble? That was it. One question. One moment of external validation. One subtle acknowledgement from outside Amazon that Meghan's value was plummeting industry-wide. That was the moment Amazon knew their instinct wasn't isolated. Hollywood as a whole was shifting. Doors were closing. Patience was thinning. Eyes were rolling. And Meghan's brand wasn't just weakening. It was collapsing. But if you think that was the end of the chapter, it wasn't. Because what Amazon learned next is what truly pushed them to terminate everything. What did they learn? That the insurance concern wasn't the only pattern forming around Meghan. There was another, a pattern far more volatile. A pattern no corporation wants connected to their projects, partnerships, or public image. A pattern that made Amazon realize this wasn't just about business. It was about potential reputation damage on a scale they weren't willing to risk. And that second pattern? That was the real bomb. The one no one saw coming. The one that made Amazon say, erase her name. Erase the association. Erase the future. So what was that second pattern? What was the bombshell revelation that rattled Amazon MGM's internal structure and pushed them from simply distancing themselves to outright erasing Meghan Markle's name from every corner of their studio ecosystem? Here's where the story burns hotter, because this second pattern wasn't about insurance, wasn't about scheduling conflicts, wasn't about public perception, and wasn't even about Meghan's unpredictable media strategy. It was something far more threatening in the corporate world, a growing trail of professionals refusing to work with her. Not a rumor, not gossip, a pattern, a documented sequence of no thank yous, not interested, not again, and please, anyone but her. These weren't tabloids. These were people inside the industry. Writers, producers, consultants, coordinators, even mid-level executives, the backbone of Hollywood. The people who make the machine run. And once Amazon realized that Meghan wasn't just difficult for them, but difficult for everyone, the truth hit like a shockwave. The problem wasn't the project. The problem wasn't the negotiation. The problem wasn't miscommunication. The problem was Meghan herself. And studios don't fix a person. They remove the person. So when this second pattern landed on the table, documented, verified, undeniable, Amazon MGM sounded the internal alarm. Code red became code black. A crisis meeting was called. And this time, it wasn't scheduled. It wasn't on the calendar. It wasn't planned. It was assembled urgently, quietly, privately. The kind of meeting where phones are confiscated, laptops closed, and doors locked. This is where the infamous line was allegedly spoken. This is where Meghan's fate was sealed. This is where the erasure began. Let me bring you into that room. A long rectangular table. Frosted glass walls. A snapshot of Los Angeles skyline glowing just beyond the window. Senior executives sitting stone-faced, shifting in their chairs. The kind of tension that feels heavy even when no one has spoken yet. Legal counsel on standby. PR strategists glancing at each other, shaking their heads subtly. A mood so tense it feels like the air could crack. The head of the meeting, a senior Amazon MGM executive, opens with a single line. We have a problem. Not issue. Not concern. Not complication. Problem. And everyone in the room knows exactly who the problem is. The first presentation begins. A summary of Meghan's communication patterns. Inconsistent, reactionary, confrontational. The second presentation. A breakdown of industry feedback. Professionals refusing to collaborate, citing unnecessary tension, unrealistic expectations, and unmanageable demands. The third presentation. Risk projections if Amazon continues working with her. Brand damage, legal escalation, investor hesitation. The fourth presentation, the leaked sentiment that Meghan's camp was already pushing narratives to the press. And the fifth presentation, the one that changed everything, a detailed report showing that Meghan had burned through more industry goodwill in 4 years than most public figures do in a lifetime. A report showing that she wasn't just losing allies, she was repelling them. A report confirming that her professional relationships had become radioactive. This wasn't personal. This wasn't emotional. This wasn't subjective. This was data. And data is what corporations trust more than anything else. After the fifth report, a silence fell over the room. The heavy, suffocating kind that tells you a decision is about to be made. A senior vice president leaned forward, tapped his pen against the table, and said the sentence that would define this entire Hollywood war. She is nothing to us. 6 words, spoken calmly, coldly, firmly, and the room didn't argue. They nodded. Now let me ask you something directly. Can you imagine the moment a corporation decides you no longer hold value? Can you imagine executives, people who once treated you as a major asset, now discussing you as a liability with no future? Can you imagine being the topic of a conversation where the conclusion is erasure, not compromise? Because that's exactly what was happening. She is nothing to us wasn't an insult. It was a declaration, a shift from considering Meghan an asset to considering her irrelevant. Think about how brutal that is. Think about how final that is. Think about how cold and mathematical it feels when you're talking about a human being. But that's the thing most celebrities don't understand. Hollywood is not emotional. Hollywood is not loyal. Hollywood is not sentimental. The moment your name becomes more trouble than revenue, you become nothing. The meeting continued with chilling precision. Phase 1. Remove Meghan from all internal development lists. Phase 2. Cancel all pending discussions, calls, or pitch meetings involving her. Phase 3. Reassign personnel previously connected to her projects. Phase 4. Issue internal guidance requiring all future mentions of her name to be redirected, minimized, or avoided. Phase 5. Prepare documentation defending Amazon if Meghan escalates legally or publicly. Phase 6. Quietly reroute media inquiries away from any association with her. In one meeting, Meghan's Hollywood trajectory with Amazon went from complicated to over to erased. But here's the emotional twist. Meghan's team had no idea this meeting was happening. While Amazon was constructing a corporate wall around themselves, Meghan was still sending messages, still venting, still reacting with emotion instead of strategy. She was playing a personal game. Amazon was playing a corporate one. Then came the moment that escalated things even further. Halfway through the meeting, a manager entered the room holding a printed email, not from Meghan directly, but from someone within her circle. A message that suggested Meghan believed Amazon had mistreated her. A message that hinted she was considering her options. A message that sounded suspiciously like preparation for public escalation. Execs scanned the email, then looked at each other, then shook their heads. This confirms it, one of them said. She's not stopping. And that's when Amazon changed from defensive to offensive. Remember, corporations don't like threats, but they hate unpredictability even more. The meeting took a darker turn. This wasn't just about removing Meghan. This was about protecting Amazon from her. One executive reportedly put it in stark terms. We're not just dealing with difficulty. We're dealing with instability. That cannot follow us into Q4. Harsh, cold, merciless. But in corporate logic, it was the only decision that made sense. And here's where this chapter takes its emotional punch. Meghan believed she was standing up for herself. Amazon believed she was cornering them. Meghan thought she was protecting her reputation. Amazon thought she was threatening theirs. Meghan expected the studio to panic. Amazon expected her to escalate. Both sides convinced they were right. Both sides convinced they were justified. Both sides convinced the other was dangerous. But only one side had the power to bury the other. And they were about to use it. What happened next wasn't a press release. Wasn't a public announcement. Wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was something worse. Something quieter. Something far more destructive. A small folder was slid across the table. A folder containing Meghan's full risk file. A folder containing the patterns, the inconsistencies, the conflicts, the industry refusals, the behavioral red flags. The final page of the file was labeled, Recommendation, Permanent Disassociation. But the real bombshell? The real twist? The real moment that shifted this from problem to career burial. It wasn't in the file. It wasn't in an email. It wasn't in a leaked memo. It came from someone in the room. An executive with access to information Meghan never expected Amazon to uncover. Something personal. Something sensitive. Something that made the entire room fall silent. And when that revelation was spoken aloud, Amazon's decision wasn't just final. It became personal. And that revelation? Well, what they learned next is something Meghan absolutely did not want them to know. What did Amazon learn? What details surfaced in that room so quietly, so unexpectedly, so devastatingly, that even seasoned executives, people who have seen Hollywood's darkest meltdowns, its ugliest feuds, its most chaotic implosions, suddenly stopped speaking? What revelation made hardened corporate strategists sit back in their chairs, exchange looks, and suddenly understand exactly why Meghan Markle was threatening lawsuits, firing off emails, and spiraling into defensive mode? It wasn't scandal. It wasn't gossip. It wasn't some tabloid-style secret. No, this was deeper, more damaging, more permanently reputation-altering. Here's the truth. Amazon found evidence that Meghan wasn't just reacting emotionally. She was trying to cover something up. Something big. Something she feared would destroy her credibility. Something she believed Amazon might expose if she didn't shut them down first. The revelation? Meghan was caught contradicting her own narrative. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly, in places where it mattered the most. Contracts, negotiations, and behind-the-scenes communications. And let's be clear, in Hollywood, everyone exaggerates. Everyone embellishes. Everyone plays with the truth to some degree. But contradictions inside contracts? Inside legal negotiations? Inside pre-production planning? That's not a PR problem. That's a credibility problem. And credibility is the foundation of every legal argument, every professional relationship, every corporate partnership. Amazon discovered that Meghan had said one thing to executives, another to legal teams, a third to PR contacts, and sometimes a fourth version to the press. Conflicting stories, inconsistent claims, altered timelines, statements that contradicted previous statements. It wasn't scandalous. It was worse. It was proof she was unreliable in environments where reliability is everything. And when Amazon's legal team cross-referenced her statements over the span of months, a chilling pattern emerged. Meghan wasn't just inconsistent. She was rewriting events to suit whichever narrative benefited her in the moment. And when a studio sees that pattern forming, they stop trusting you instantly. Because if your truth keeps changing, you are no longer a strategic partner. You are a liability. Now, let's sit with the emotional weight of this. Imagine being in Meghan's position. Imagine knowing, deep down, that some of your own claims don't line up. Imagine seeing a corporation begin to notice the cracks. Imagine feeling the walls close in. Imagine fearing that your narrative, the very thing you built your brand on, is losing stability. What do people do when their narrative starts unraveling? They panic. They overreact. They lash out. They threaten lawsuits. And that's exactly why Meghan threatened Amazon. Not to fix the relationship. Not to negotiate a misunderstanding. Not to demand fair treatment. But to stop Amazon from exposing her contradictions. She thought the threat would scare them. Instead, it confirmed their suspicions. Because let's ask the question plainly. Why would someone threaten a lawsuit if they weren't hiding something? Why escalate so aggressively unless you're frightened of what might come out? What did Meghan think Amazon was preparing to reveal? This chapter answers that question, and the answer is devastating for her. Back in the meeting room, after the risk file was reviewed and the industry refusal pattern was presented, a mid-level executive cleared their throat and dropped the revelation that froze the room. Meghan altered her claims between her contract draft, her verbal commitments, and her public positioning. We can prove it. Silence. Real silence. The kind where everyone knows they've crossed into dangerous territory. The legal counsel immediately sat forward. What do you mean prove it? The executive slid a folder across the table. Inside the folder were documents, emails, and recorded transcripts showing discrepancies in Meghan's narrative. Claims she repeated publicly that didn't match what she told Amazon. Timelines she altered. Agreements she refuted later despite initially approving them. Details she changed depending on who she was speaking to. This wasn't a small misunderstanding. It wasn't sloppy communication. It wasn't misinterpretation. It was a pattern of shaping the truth and reshaping it whenever convenient. The emotional impact on the room was instant. This wasn't just a difficult partner. This was someone who could not be trusted legally. And trust is the backbone of every contract. Here's where the situation took a darker turn. If Meghan ever sued, Amazon would bring this pattern into court. They would lay out every inconsistency. They would dismantle her credibility piece by piece. They knew it. And deep down, Meghan knew it too. That's why she panicked. That's why she sent the threatening email. That's why she escalated. That's why she leaked. That's why she lashed out. Fear. Pure fear. Fear that Amazon would expose her in a way she couldn't spin. Fear that the narrative she spent years constructing would unravel. Fear that the public would stop believing her. Fear that Hollywood would see her not as a victim, but as unreliable. And then someone else in the meeting asked the question no one wanted to voice. Is it possible she threatened to sue precisely because she knew we discovered this? The room fell silent again. And that's when the senior Amazon MGM executive said the second line that sealed Meghan's fate. We are not dealing with someone who is misinformed. We are dealing with someone who is manipulating the narrative. With that, the tone of the meeting shifted. This was no longer about damage control. This was about protecting the studio from someone who could weaponize inconsistency against them. Meghan had crossed into a new category, not just risky, not just volatile, but dangerous to the brand. And the executives knew it. Now let's step into Meghan's perspective again, because this is where the emotional impact deepens. Imagine being someone who thrives on controlling the story, who relies on public sympathy, who builds their image on carefully crafted narratives, and suddenly realizing a corporation holds proof that your narratives don't match. Imagine the panic, the desperation, the need to regain control before the truth spreads. And so, Meghan did the one thing she always does when she feels cornered. She demanded compliance. She insisted Amazon respond to her on her terms. She tried to strong-arm them with legal tone. She tried to scare them with reputational consequences. But Amazon wasn't afraid. They were preparing. Because what Meghan didn't know was that Amazon wasn't just defending themselves. They were preparing a counterstrike, a legal defense file, a PR shield strategy, a crisis management plan, a do-not-engage protocol, a complete severance strategy. And then came the final blow of the meeting, the conclusion that made everything irreversible. We need to bury her involvement before she buries us. Cold, ruthless, corporate, but in their eyes, necessary. Now, here's where the tension spikes. Meghan still believed she had leverage. She still believed she could intimidate Amazon into backing down. She still believed her lawsuit threat would make them reconsider. She didn't realize they had already uncovered something even worse for her. Something beyond contradictions. Something beyond inconsistent claims. Something beyond industry refusal. Something Amazon believed could destroy her reputation permanently if it ever leaked. And that hidden piece of information? That was the real secret Meghan was terrified Amazon would expose. And the moment Amazon's legal counsel presented it, everything changed. So what was this shocking detail? The one Amazon's legal counsel slid across the table like a quiet grenade. What piece of information did they believe could collapse Meghan Markle's credibility so completely that not even her most loyal public defenders could spin it? What truth, buried beneath layers of polished PR, carefully curated interviews, and carefully worded statements, made Amazon realize that partnering with Meghan wasn't just risky, it was dangerous? Here it is. Amazon discovered that Meghan had privately admitted a version of events that contradicted the public narrative she built her entire brand on. Not to the media, not to the public, but to legal representatives during early negotiation phases, statements recorded, timestamped, digitally archived. And those private statements did not align with the story she presented publicly in interviews, articles, documentaries, and speeches. This wasn't a small difference. It wasn't a wording issue. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a foundational contradiction, the kind of revelation that, if ever exposed, would force the public to question everything she's ever claimed. And Hollywood? Hollywood doesn't gamble with someone whose public persona rests on a narrative with cracks slicing through its foundation. When this detail surfaced, the meeting room changed instantly. Executives stopped reacting emotionally. They shifted into strategy mode. Cold, focused, surgical. Because now they weren't just dealing with a difficult partner. They were dealing with someone who publicly claimed one truth and privately confessed another. And the moment a studio sees that, they don't walk away. They run. Amazon's legal team laid it out. If she escalates this publicly and we respond with what we have, her credibility collapses. Read that again. They didn't say might collapse. They said collapses. As in, guaranteed. As in, irreversible. And that's when the tone changed from defensive protection to offensive erasure. Because if Meghan posed this level of risk, Amazon's decision wasn't just to distance themselves. It was to eliminate any association, any trace, any historical tether that linked their brand to hers. They needed a plan, not to pause Meghan, not to wait her out, but to bury the connection entirely. This became the birth of Amazon's internal blackout strategy. A strategy designed not only to remove Meghan from future opportunities, but to make sure no one remembered she was ever connected to them at all. Let's break down how ruthlessly, how quietly, how precisely a corporation like Amazon wipes someone out. The executives began outlining Phase 1, soft erasure. This phase required subtle, behind-the-scenes adjustments. Meghan's name removed from future internal scheduling documents. Her email threads closed and archived under inactive client. Her projects quietly recategorized as indefinitely delayed. Internal reminders sent to teams to avoid initiating communication. Project descriptions rewritten to remove any reference to her involvement. Talent coordinators instructed to answer inquiries with "not currently under consideration." This wasn't done with malice. It was done with corporate efficiency. The room nodded. The legal team approved. Phase 2, pipeline shutdown. This phase was more aggressive. Cancel all pending development discussions involving Meghan. Decline proposals from agents pitching her name. Inform partner studios and co-producers that Meghan is not available. Remove her from brainstorming slates and casting considerations. Freeze any PR-friendly initiatives connected to her. A senior VP added the line that summarized the entire phase. We cannot allow her name to enter our development ecosystem again. Again, not pause. Not reconsider. Eliminate. Phase 3. Public distance. Now the tone shifted even colder. This wasn't about internal silence. This was about external protection. Direct press teams to avoid mentioning Meghan in interviews. Prepare neutral public statements that redirect all Meghan-related questions. Decline to comment on her publicly unless legally required. Quietly correct media articles that associate Amazon with her name. Redirect journalists to unrelated projects when Meghan comes up. This is how studios remove you from the cultural bloodstream. Not with public statements, with absence. But Phase 4? Phase 4 is where the strategy took a darker and more intense turn. The kind that tells you Amazon wasn't simply cutting ties, they were preparing for war. Phase 4, preemptive shielding. This required gathering everything. Every inconsistency, every contradiction, every discrepancy, every piece of documentation that proved the pattern Meghan desperately didn't want exposed. Why? Because Amazon believed Meghan would escalate again. And when she did, they wanted to be armed. Their internal directive was chilling. If she threatens us publicly, we defend. If she accuses us, we counter. If she sues, we bury her claims with documentation. This wasn't emotional. This was strategic sterilization. They weren't trying to hurt Meghan. They were preparing to protect themselves from her. Now let's shift back to Meghan's perspective, because emotionally, this chapter hits hardest when we see the contrast between her assumptions and Amazon's reality. Meghan believed Amazon was mishandling her. She believed she was fighting a corporation acting unfairly. She believed her lawsuit threat would force Amazon to justify their behavior. She didn't realize Amazon was holding something stronger than her narratives, stronger than her PR, stronger than her interviews. Proof. Proof of inconsistency. Proof of contradiction. Proof that she wasn't telling the same story behind the scenes as she was telling the world. And here's the devastating irony. Meghan's greatest strength is narrative. But narrative only works when it's consistent. And Amazon had the evidence that hers wasn't. Now imagine being Meghan. Imagine feeling the world shifting beneath your feet. Imagine realizing that the corporation you're pushing against has already prepared your downfall. Imagine not knowing exactly what they know, but knowing they know something. This is where fear begins. Real fear. Not PR fear. Not tabloid fear. Career fear. And that fear pushed Meghan into making the next mistake. A mistake Amazon anticipated, predicted, and prepared for. She made a demand. A big one. A demand so outrageous it stunned even the people inside her own camp. A demand that proved, beyond any doubt, that Meghan wasn't negotiating from strength, she was scrambling from panic. And that demand, well, that's where the blackout strategy escalated into a direct corporate strike. Because what Meghan asked for was so unrealistic, so aggressive, and so obviously rooted in fear that Amazon didn't just refuse it. They used it as their final justification to bury her completely.